Well, I can tell you now, we're in the end game. What's up, guys? That guy with a pencil here from Fat Newman 2. Have it on and keep it on at all times. Here's another fun fact. We are here to talk about how I'm feeling about the current state of Chainsaw Man. However, I only have 15 minutes to tell you, so let me start this 15-minute timer right now and get into it. So, ultimately, I will let you know I'm leaning more towards on the positive side for Chainsaw Man Deska. But I do think, ultimately, that's because I can kind of sense the end. I believe we are definitely nearing the final parts of Chainsaw Man. Ultimately, I don't think we're getting more than, like, maybe 20 chapters. I feel like we're kind of really wrapping it up. These last 3 chapters and how they're paced, very specifically chapter 209, chapter 210, and chapter 211, all give me massive final rest vibes. And if you don't know what the final rest is, essentially it's that last area in a video game where the video game essentially reaches out to you, knocks on the door, and is like, hey, you completed all your side quests, right? You're comfortable with your kit, right? Because once you walk through this door, the credits are going to start rolling. And I feel heavily like that, mainly for a couple reasons. Number one, let's talk about the big elephant in the room. Yoru's massive amps. Notably, with her being put in this position of being stronger than even the primal fears of this universe, to the point where she can casually low diff them and tank their attacks, all thanks to the rebirth of her baby, La Bomba Nuclear. It just seems to make absolutely perfect sense that she's amped to the highest point she can be amped, especially with how war is defined, as specifically armed human conflict, unless Fujimoto decides to invent something even higher than Las Bombas Nuclear. I don't think Yoru can get any more powerful. And typically when your protagonist, or deuteragonist, whatever you think Yoru is, gets this strong, usually you're kind of in the end game. And then obviously we have Lil D themselves smacking their little, well, there's no way I could say that next phrase that would not immediately boom me. But with it being the case, then we have Lil D smacking their meat on the table and being like, hey, I may have made a mistake here or there, and made the deuteragonist a little bit too strong in order to stop myself. Ultimately, with Lil D, our former main antagonist, you know, the whole character that not even part 2 was about stopping, but realistically, all of part 1 was kind of about stopping, because remember, Makiba's main goal was to use Denji, aka Chainsaw Man, in order to wipe Big D, well, Lil D, from existence. So ultimately, this is the culmination of an over 200 chapter, 2-part narrative. Our main antagonist, even if they never technically were a main antagonist now that we know Lil D's motivations, but regardless, they very specifically are like, yeah, we may be cooked, to the point where she had to get her sister and another fella to come in and save Denji from immediately being weaponized to boom Big D, or Lil D. And with that being the case, the only character who's left to get a giga massive crazy next level amp is our titular character himself. And ultimately, that also kind of happens towards the ends of narratives. Notably, your main character will either be overpowered from the start, and then overpowered for a majority of the run, or underpowered for a good chunk of the manga, but strong enough to still compete, which is what I would say Denji has been throughout the manga, and then practically right either at the final rest or in the final battle will get some sort of decisive amp in order to actually be able to compete with the major antagonist, who now does admittedly appear to be Yoru. Like, notably, there was definitely a hot debate on whether or not Yoru was actually going to become the main antagonist, or if she was going to stick as a possible side antagonist, a what-if antagonist, essentially. Sort of like how Kenjaku in JJK is a what-if antagonist rather than a main antagonist. Sugano was the main antagonist for JJK, while Kenjaku was a side antagonist. Both very, very important, both fundamental to the structure of the narrative, but ultimately, one got the main villain role, the other was a side villain. Same thing here for Chainsaw Man. It seemed like Yoru, if anything, was going to stick to there, if not develop into a completely different thing. And obviously, there definitely is still a chance for that, but that chance is just so much lower now that I just highly doubt it generally. But with that being the case, her leaping into the major antagonist role means that Denji needs to get some kind of amp, or does he? And this is where my praise and glaze for Chainsaw Man's writing typically comes into account, even if chapter 211 did have a little bit of a freaky side to it at the end that I'm not really the biggest fan of. But with that being the case, Denji may or may not get a Giga Amp. Notably, we already know his quote-unquote Giga Amp state is Pochita Black, right? Essentially, when Pochita comes out, takes the reins, goes absolutely crazy, goes absolutely buku bonkers. But as far as we know, unless the fear of chainsaws has increased drastically, Pochita wasn't even aging level. And aging is a primal fear. And falling, you know, another primal fear got absolutely violated by Yoru and then turned into clothes. So, would it even make sense for Denji to get a Giga Amp? And the ultimate reason I feel like he may still not get a Giga Amp and only extra triple down the fact that I feel like we're in the end game and I'm kind of okay with that, is the fact that he didn't really get a Giga Amp against Makima outside of Chainsaw Man Black coming out, who didn't even finish the fight. That was Denji finishing the fight. And ultimately, at the core of all of this, despite how many characters and narratives and plot lines have been introduced into Chainsaw Man, and obviously we still do have the plight of Asa, who, hold on, I need to do something. No! I did the wrong thing! No! Come back! Okay, but with it being the case, with the plight of Asa as well as a character sort of being, dare I say, consumed by Yoru as a whole, it definitely does feel like we are focusing on Denji, you know, the titular character. And I don't think Denji even really needs a Giga Super Crazy Amp. I'm smelling almost, not necessarily a rerun, but a remix on the original ending of Chainsaw Man Part 1. Not the original ending, just the ending of Chainsaw Man Part 1, where Denji uses his humanity to win out over Yoru, the Giga-powered super goddess of war, rather than just getting a crazy Buku Bonkers amp to fight her. So, ultimately, I've talked all about this being the final end, the final rest, how I feel about that, in the general sense that I'm happy with it, but how do I feel about everything else? How do I feel about how we've gotten here? How do I feel about the current state of it? And how do I feel like it's going to go? Ultimately, how we got here is one of my minor gripes and issues. Notably, I talked about everything in the final rest just being like how powerful the characters are and where they're being located and where they're being placed, especially by chapter 211. But obviously, the biggest way that we got here in massive fashion wasn't just the fact that the Nostradamus Prophecy's timeline is rushing up to the current point, meaning we would have to reach it anyway, but also it's Yoru getting Giga Amped. Yoru getting Giga Amped to go from getting Fodderized to Fodderizing is... I'm of two minds about it, being completely honest with you. One part of me is like, I get it. The Nostradamus Prophecy deadline was already coming up before this. She needed to get amped somehow. And honestly, I do actually like, if it is in a very twisted way, the reintegration of Las Bombas Nuclear as just something that humanity recreated, because ultimately humans are innately violent and will always find a way back to certain concepts. And ultimately, one concept we always find a way to evolve is conflict and war and stuff like that. So Las Bombas Nuclear being reinvented, yes, it actually is a logical thing that makes sense. Timeline-wise, it kind of lines up. And ultimately, 211 sort of does some back padding for it to make it feel more digestible, with Lil D-Strip admitting that ultimately, my many efforts to stop that prophecy changed the future into an even worse one, right? Ultimately, Yoru and the timing of her getting a Giga Amp is super narratively convenient because she was about to get diffed by by falling. So yeah, I don't like that. But thematically, and with the whole idea of avoiding one's destiny is the only way to really reach it, plus either trying to avoid or change your fate is a way to worsen your fate than what it already was. I like the narrative thematic themes. I just don't like how they were reached kind of, sort of. Just, I really don't like you're getting a Giga Amp seemingly out of nowhere, fitting to the fact that you will always get a Giga Amp and will never actually have to, like, seriously lose a major battle that is actually relevant to her narrative. So I'm a bit 50-50 on that. But character-wise, how do I feel? Ultimately, you know, I love a good story, and that's kind of what I've been talking about, like the final rest, where we are ending-wise, how the pacing's doing, and how I feel a little bit iffy on that. But how do you feel about the character work? Notably, I think Yoru definitely still has more potential. Like, notably, even with her transcendental evolution into this, like, really reincarnated war goddess, yeah, it's legendary, it's cool, it's beefy, but I still think a good portion of her humanity is what's going to be ultimately kind of her downfall, right? Because the story of Chainsaw Man Part 2, as much as it is Denji's story and a story about grief, it is also a story about self-perception, what it means to be human, and how one becomes human, even if accidentally. And obviously, Yoru's whole thing is slowly but surely becoming human, even in spite of her desire to make Denji less human. And notably, I feel like a big character, not just Denji, that I do need to talk about, who I do have admittedly kind of mixed feelings on in general, is Asa. And how she sort of gets banished here at the end of chapter 210. Not to be seen, at least for a little while. Notably, this kind of implies that her ability to take over her body as long as she feels fear either isn't working or she doesn't feel fear, which could play into her own development of becoming less human as Yoru has become more human, sort of intermixing those two characters. Do I like the duo? Yes. I just think Asa definitely needed a bit more time before we kind of locked her away in the cage. And ultimately, I feel like Asa, once again, feeding back into the idea that Denji doesn't actually need a super amp, will probably be really, really important to, you know, being what Denji can reach out to and being the one to facilitate, you know, Yoru not absolutely going buku bonkers. Then, of course, you know, I gotta talk about the titular man himself, Denji. How do I feel about Denji and his character writing? like, here's the thing. I like Denji. I have liked Denji. I will continue to like Denji. But Denji is very akin to a ball. AKA, a ball that means when you drop it from your hand, sometimes it'll bounce and stay in the same place. Sometimes it'll bounce and roll forward. Sometimes it'll bounce and roll backwards. And all we're doing with Denji is consistently picking up the ball. It's very good realistic writing, as in this character falls back into the same vices, the same circular grips and stuff like that. It's a very circular story, once again going with the ball analogy. But at the same time, like, man I'm like, Denji, I expect better from you at this point, dog. I'm not going to go into it. I'm not showing what happened in chapter 211, but Denji only conforms to the plot, quote-unquote, and gets on board because he gets flashed, because ultimately he's still a man controlled by his base urges and desires, because, you know, he still hasn't really gone to therapy or anything like that. So I like Denji. I like it. It's just like, and I think that's how I kind of feel in the macro sense. Well, at the start of the video, and I'll say it again, I am leaning positive towards the current state of Chainsaw Man, not just because it's ending, and I like when things end, because I like the culmination of stories, and I love to reread through a story and be like, oh, I get this, that, and the third, but also, I'm leaning, because we're at a point that I feel like has to be the ending, just based on, like, all the internal narrative factors, like the Nostradamus prophecy timeline, like Yoru getting Giga amped, like, really just those two main things. I feel like we kind of have to be the endpoint at that. But also, I feel like the characters, in some cases, either needed more time. And specifically Asa. I feel like Asa's a really underdeveloped character up to this point. She has her moments, but like they're so few and far between in comparison to like the monster Goliath of character work that Yoru has gotten. But if not needed more time, I think need a bit more stability before we could reach a hypothetical end. Personally, I don't think we're getting a part 3. I think it's kind of over here at part 2. I'm not sure exactly how you transcend death and or the goddess of war as like concepts to fear, unless you do go under the idea it was kind of like soft launched in the aging arc, the idea of maybe transcending the traditional human concepts and making new ones, giving birth to new Ds. Unless we do something like that, this does seem to be the ending, and ultimately I don't think Denji has reached a point of character stability that I would like for him to reach. And while Yoru's development is interesting, I think it'll culminate in an interesting way. I don't think that Asa's really had the apex of character development required for her to be at her perfect peak. And ultimately, whether or not Lil D is going to end up still being some type of antagonist, or is truly just going to become a supporting character, the other character who I feel like gets really done dirty by the pacing of the manga is the character who appears but doesn't even get to speak, in Fami. She really feels like an afterthought. And it's crazy to say, considering how well Chainsaw Man has really, like, not necessarily stretched itself out, but has allowed itself to breathe in many certain ways, and has allowed for certain characters to have circular writing, such as your Denji, such as your Yoru, such as your Asas. But Fami really does feel like an afterthought, and I feel like it's because we're moving at a pace that is actually kind of insane. And the reason I think it's insane is it didn't really have to be this way. As far as I know, Fujimoto isn't on any sort of like real hard line schedule. There was that whole like section of part 2 that did feel a bit aimless for a while. So, like, that could have been time used to develop these characters a little bit more. I wish Fanny still got a little bit more. There's time. And that's the thing where I find myself overall. I'm leaning more positive because I still like the character work. I like building to the final rest. I like certain aspects of it. And I even can appreciate the timing and, like, the dramatic irony of a lot of it, being completely honest. But despite all that, I feel like just the narrative needed a bit more time to flesh itself out. The characters needed a bit more time to flesh themselves out. Ultimately, everything just needed a bit more in a way that I don't think they're gonna get now. Like, I don't know how Fami's going to become a character I remotely care about in these next couple chapters. Even Lil D herself, while she's been an interesting background character and is now playing an interesting role as a supporting character to Denji, I still don't know if I'm going to actually care about the character because we just haven't gotten enough of her. And same thing for a character like Asa, who's gotten a lot, yet seemingly still not enough for the other main character of our main trio. And while Yoru definitely has a lot of interesting development, I feel like it's going to be curtailed just a bit. Ultimately, by her usurping the main antagonist role, but at the same time, we could see her doing what Lil D mentioned that she's doing in chapter 211, going and gathering an army and seeing how she feels about it. So, like, there still is time. There still is time. And that's why I'm still leaning towards the positive. I trust Fujimoto. Fujimoto cooked at the end of part 1, and I bet if you were to ask me, especially, like, right after Aki's death in part 1, how I'd be feeling, I'd say the same thing that I felt then is what I'm feeling now, especially when I was first reading through, if I was still reading through at that time. Notably, part 1 was done by the time I read it. But with that being the case, I'm more on the good side. I'm generally glazing. Notably, I have my points of negativity, I have my points of uncertainty, but I'm gonna let Fujimoto cook in the end. Did they cook with the end of 211? Going back to the idea of the ball. But I can trust Fujimoto enough to know that even if I'm not rocking with something right now, even if there is more time, or there isn't enough time for certain characters, I can take what I've gotten with certain characters, and ultimately, in a way, it's weird to say this, but I'm kind of ready for Chainsaw Man to end. And I'm interested to see how it's going to end in the grand scheme of things. But ultimately, I'm out of time. Hold on, tap it. I'm out of time. So if you didn't always see this video, please leave War, Death, and Chainsaws. War, Death, and Chainsaws in the comment section down below. And then thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe. Make sure that notification post you not miss out on any videos that come to the channel. Also even have a page down below where you support me for as low as $1 a month. The things like exclusive videos, early content, and more. Also now become a member of the channel for as low as $3 a month to get the same perks and more. So those perks include live reactions, this year's amateur review, ad variations of all my videos, and if you become a $12 Patreon or $12 member, you can order whatever video you want. Also a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below, and drop 5 beans for a short video, 25 beans for a long video, or any beans at all. Any support is always greatly appreciated. And I'd like to thank you so much for watching. Once again, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. This is That Guy with the Pencil, writing off. I would like to give a thank you to our sketch tier members: Eternal Flame, Redwolf 4765, Astro, Glacier XZ, Zara, Brandon Payne, J2MA, Guillaume, Buddha Uda, Alex Kenny, Enzo, Plant Crone, G Prosper, Swift Strike, Striker Man, and Autumn Mornings Lazo, Kree Panem, Super Flame Zero, Yuki Ally, and Azo2404. Then I'd like to give a thank you to our line art tier patrons: Sean, Midnight Lord 21, Kevin Encarnacion, Dread Zoen, A+A, and Victor Raji. And then I'd like to give a thank you to our ink tier members: Austin Wimberly, Auchia, and Shrimpo the Shrimp. With a long, juicy, thick, hefty thank you to our digital art tier members: J Warrior and AZ Void. And I'd like to give a thank you to our colored art tier patrons: Joaquin Munoz and Joaquin Munoz. With a final Ganshuin legendary super grumdeliumptious thank you to our glorious, legendary, handsome, costume glazing king, Calvin Elder.